Hello and welcome to Cortical Cerebral Visual Impairment, addressing visual skill development within play-based activities and natural routines. My name is Marguerite Tibaudo and I am the Assistant Director of the CVI project here at Perkins. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about this important topic of CVI accessibility and play. So I'd like to first start by sharing a quote by Fred Rogers. Play is often talked about as if it were a relief from serious learning. But for children, play is serious learning. Play is really the work of childhood. And this is so important and so valuable to remember because every waking moment, a child is engaging and playing and learning. It's so easy to look at play as this isolated event that's happening as a leisure activity, and it far exceeds that. In thinking about the brain, play is actually not frivolous. It enhances brain structure and function and increases neuroplasticity. So what is neuroplasticity? It's the brain's ability to change and adapt. And there are two different types. There's structural plasticity, which are changes based on experiences or memories. And then functional plasticity, so how brain functions move from damaged areas of the brain to undamaged areas of the brain. In thinking more about neuroplasticity, there's a wonderful quote from Dr. Lotfi Maribet available on CVINow.org, where he says, "What I would argue is most crucial is that a child has as rich an experience as possible, especially during early development. This is when the brain is highly active, forming new connections, changing, and responding to environmental stimulation." So what you come away from this is, while we know that every single brain is different, the importance of enriched experiences is the same. And as we move forward, remember, kids are kids. All children want to build relationships, have positive experiences, figure out the world, and most of all, have fun. Fun is a key element here because positive and happy experiences really do matter. They are found to increase engagement and memory. And on the opposite end, emotionally overwhelming events also has an impact on the functioning of our brain and body. So chronic stress can result in a brain trained to exist in a state of hyperarousal. And when you're in this type of state, children cannot concentrate or can become very easily frustrated, impulsive, or withdraw. So we want our engagements to be positive and happy so that children are motivated to participate and therefore will increase their learning and experiences. To play is to experience, and to experience is to learn. Experiences occur all day long. Your child is literally constantly learning. From the moment they wake up in the morning to the moment they go to sleep, everything in between is contributing to their learning and their brain development and how they perceive the world and act upon it. As I mentioned earlier, it's so easy, again, to think of play as this isolated leisure activity when it really supports so many different areas of development. So when we're thinking about play, again, so much more than sitting down with a toy or engaging in an activity. There are so many pieces of the puzzle that are being put together in that very moment. So how can we think about this a bit further? The general focus of this presentation is really to consider visual accessibility around CVI, considering the child's interests and interaction methods, and how we can best go about facilitating hands-on active engagement across environments. And while we're thinking about this, we also want to think about how can we support a balance between child-initiated activity and adult-initiated activity. So in terms of visual accessibility, in order to learn, we need to engage in meaningful experiences. We can see it, hear it, feel it, taste it, and so on. But when you think about how most young children gain access to experiences, it is very visual. Children will watch others manipulate toys, objects, or engage in activities. They hear sounds and look around to find out what caused it. They see intriguing objects or materials, and that motivates them to move towards them to obtain them. And they engage with various items to figure out what they like and they don't like. For children with CVI, this can be really difficult because they don't always know what's around them, and that can limit exploration and engagement. So when we want to think about play, we want to think about how we're going to bridge the gap. So first, we need to take the time to build relationships and trust. That's absolutely essential. When a child trusts an adult, they're going to learn more, they're going to engage further. We can think about bringing activities closer to the child and simplify the immediate environment so that's not so visually overwhelming. We can encourage exploration reaching and retrieval, and encourage exploration of the surrounding environment. We want to tell the child what's occurring around them and support the child in moving closer to these events. If we're always bringing things to the child, then they just think things magically appear. They don't know where they came from. They don't know that they have a role to play themselves in obtaining and acting on other things. And then when there's a sound in the environment, we can use language to also bridge that gap. Because if a sound occurs far away, the child might not have seen that sound source and doesn't know where it originated from. So what we can do is we can bring the child to that sound source, repeat that sound source again, if possible, and allow the child to look and feel the source if it's appropriate. Most sighted infants transition very easily from appropriate early preoccupation with their own bodies into greater interest in the environment. However, children with severe visual impairments are at risk of becoming stuck at this point. Children with CVI can't efficiently scan their environments visually for new and exciting options. And so they really can't capitalize on opportunities to act more spontaneously without some additional input from others. So they might stay very much within themselves because they don't know what else is out there and they don't know how to interact with what's around them. So this brings us to the importance of options. Due to these challenges, some children with CVI will depend on the adults to provide options. We don't know what's available unless we can experience it. So it's really important that we provide these options for children with CVI and let them know what's available and when it's available and how they can obtain it. We also want to consider a variety of hands-on experiences. So children should have experience with a wide variety of content to support the development of a complex and integrated brain. The more experiences, the better. Play that links sensory motor, cognitive, and social emotional experiences provides an ideal setting for brain development. If you think about your perception of experiences and how your experiences shape your thinking, when you can't see something, you're not going to reach for it because you don't know it's there. If you see something but you don't recognize it, you also might be hesitant to touch it. If you hear a sound but you don't know the source, will you search for it? There can be a lot of uncertainty, fear, and hesitation in children with CVI because experiences matter and shape willingness to explore. If a child has reached out and touched something and had a poor experience in that moment, they touched a hot stove or they touched something spiky or they felt a texture that was unpleasant, that can lead them to not want to explore further because they don't trust what they see and can't get enough visual information to reach out and initiate interaction. So we really have to think about past experiences and how we can shape new experiences and increase that exploration in a safe manner. There's a lot of issues as far as having that surrounding environment accessible for the child with CVI, and it can be impacted frequently by clutter and crowding. So take this picture, for example. Where does one thing start and another begin? Would you be efficient in exploring this environment? Probably not. You wouldn't know what's available, what the actions are, what it does, how you can interact with it. A child who's sitting in their playroom might have a visual image such as this. And again, this is a simulation, so it's by no means comparable to a child's vision with CVI. They might see bright colors and say, okay, I'm in my playroom. There's bright colors, therefore it's a toy, and they might act on it. But it doesn't guarantee that they know exactly what they're seeing and recognizing. So if you take them to another environment, they might be less likely to involve themselves because now they're out of context, they're not getting those same cues, and that can impact some free range exploration as well. So some thoughts about how we can make some of these environments accessible. We want to make materials available, but we don't want to force interaction. A lot of children with CVI prefer objects that are highly familiar or very closely related to the objects they've already interacted with. But that doesn't mean we can't make new items available. We just don't want to force their hand in engaging with them right away because that could cause stress and a negative reaction. We want to give gentle, non-invasive cues to signal their presence. So we show an object, we provide some motion, language, here's your ball, or sound if the toy or object thing makes a sound. And then tell the child where it is and remind them periodically. It's on your left on the floor, it's on your right on the table. Remind them of where it is, and if appropriate, give a tactile cue or help them to find it tactually. When you're thinking about tactile engagement, cues, and prompting, light touch cues at the elbow or arm is actually less invasive than forcing items into your hands. If you can't expect the anticipation of an object coming towards you or someone interacting with you, having someone take your hands and manipulate them or put them on something is really invasive, and it's been found to be very stressful for a lot of children. So in thinking about this, consider hand under hand demonstration over hand to allow the child to be in control. So if you're going to take a child's hand to show them where an object is, put your hand under their hand and guide them to the object. So this allows the child to pull back if they don't want to engage, and they can trust that you are leading that engagement and showing them where it is. And most importantly, allow time and repeat exposure to build up to an activity. If you show a child or engage in an activity once and the child's not participating, that doesn't mean they'll never participate in that. Try it time and time again, build up that trust, build up that routine, and hopefully over time the child might show some interest. And if not, then we'll move on to the next activity. It's always important to remember that using vision can be really hard for children with CVI. It takes a lot of energy to attend, to process information, to make sense of what's going on around them. So when activities involve toys and objects that the child's interested in, they're likely to be more engaged and, again, want to learn. So really capitalize on their interests and make it meaningful. And then hopefully they'll be more motivated to use their vision and use their vision more efficiently. We always have to remember that we don't always need toys. Sometimes it's just human interaction, being present, being silly, using your hands. Your hands can clap, your hands can cheer, your hands can do row, row, row your boat and hold your child's hands and go back and forth. There's a lot of ways we can play and engage and increase learning without things. Social interactions are a key part of play. Our actions are reinforced and are modified based on the reaction of our communication partners. My feedback to you is going to change your response to me and your interaction. And so it's a really nice loop for early communication and ongoing language development. You want to think about strategically implementing hands-on learning. So hands-on interaction with the physical environment is central to early learning. It provides young children with multi-sensory access, an understanding of how their world works, how they relate to it, and how to problem solve when issues come up. How do I react to certain situations and events? And how am I going to figure out which approach I'm going to take? It's really important to remember, too, that all of our learning first originates from interactions with objects. I cannot stress this enough. It's really important that we focus on that hands-on engagement. Hands-on engagement allows for reinforcement of language and concepts. And in terms of concepts of objects, children need to know that first, objects exist. So I see it, I know it's there. Objects have permanence. I know it's still there even though it's in a drawer or it went under a blanket or rolled under the couch. It still exists when it's not in my line of sight or beyond my arm's reach. Objects differ from one another. So I know that toothbrush is different from the toothpaste. Objects have characteristics. That's a toothbrush because it is long and has bristles on the end. Objects have names or labels, so being able to identify something, that is a toothbrush. And that objects have function or use. So that's a toothbrush, and I use it to clean my teeth. It's important when we're thinking about interaction with objects that we understand that concepts of things, events, people, and actions are different than skills. So for example, I can scrub a toothbrush on my tooth and not know the difference between clean and dirty. So it's an action an action is different than a concept. So there's immense value in object play and physical interaction because the more we experience, the more equipped we are to figure out the world around us. When you're thinking about conceptual development, so understanding how the world works and how you relate to things in the world, it's those experiences that are going to shape that over time. It's the hands-on active experience. I cannot stress that enough. We also want to constantly promote active exploration. So physical actions on objects provide the motivation to further explore the environment for new skills to master. So the child is constantly playing, touching, feeling, listening, engaging with objects and understanding, okay, what does this thing do? How about if I did it this way? How can I get that thing? So it's really about how I can manipulate the environment and things to make different changes and different learning experiences. And visual accessibility actually helps us build visual attack skills. So for example, I showed a picture of the phone on the left, an old-timey black telephone, to my daughter, and she immediately said, phone. So she had enough visual representation in her mind to identify this as a telephone. When I showed her an even older version of a telephone, she looked at it and said, a shower? Because her mental image of this picture was closely resembling a shower nozzle, not a telephone that she's experienced in any other shape or form. So my daughter does not have CVI. She's 4 years old. But the point is, we all use these strategies to make sense of new information. And so this is really important for children with CVI, because the more they're interacting with things, the more visual accessibility they have, the more tactile experiences and auditory experience they have, and are then putting all these pieces of information together, help them form concepts and help them to build those skills necessary to figure out new information when it comes along. To support children with CVI in developing these skills, we need to provide them with opportunities to explore different objects. So I already talked about bringing up the importance of options. They need to see them in different perspectives. Objects can look very different in very different perspectives. So you might recognize this water bottle if I hold it upright, but now if I've turned it away from you, it has completely different shape and different attributes. All different angles show different visual perspectives. And you're only going to get that if somebody is actively moving something around or the child's engaging with it themselves. We also want to demonstrate the function of objects. Children can self-manipulate objects to figure that out, and can also partially be supported by the demonstration of adults using hands-on support. We want to further tie auditory or tactile features to visual experiences. As I mentioned earlier, if there's a sound further away, how can we bring them to the sound? Give a visual experience tied to that sound. Perhaps it's the air conditioner turning on, going over, feeling the air conditioner, seeing the air conditioner, understanding there's a source to the sound, and also a tactile component. And then we also want to provide verbal labels that identify attributes and function in relation to previously learned concepts. So it's exactly what I was talking about with that phone before. What makes a phone a phone? What makes a book a book? What makes a dog a dog? All of these pieces of visual information need to be explicitly taught and compared to familiar events that the child's already experienced, because any new learning is going to be tied to our memories of previously learned concepts or experiences. So we have to think about play as not just occurring in your playroom. Play can occur in contrived and controlled settings. It can occur in generalized environments and across routines. And I think it's important that we know that we can only control so much. We talk a lot about modifying the environment for a child with CVI, and it's really critical, and I'm going to talk about that further in a bit. But there are limitations. There are scenarios where you're not going to be able to control everything, such as the zoo or the supermarket. So we think of ways that we can make it accessible and one step at a time, and support that child through those visually inaccessible environments and events. So now, CVI and the environment. The environment must entice the child to interact without overstimulation. I talked about stress and the impact on learning and participation earlier. So when the child's overstimulated, they actually might not be able to process anything, and therefore may withdraw or become hyperactive. So think about that blurry photo I showed you earlier of all the colors in this jumbled playroom. If it's too much, the child's not going to want to participate because it's just too overwhelming for their visual system. So a learning situation that contains the right balance of stimuli, so what materials you're giving them, what the activity is, promotes a degree of alertness that allows stimuli to be processed, organized internally, and integrated to foster learning. So we have to find that right balance of presentation and environment. So here are some very general considerations for visual accessibility in your environment. This is going to change based on your child, based on their familiarity, based on their vision, based on their experiences. So again, very general. The number one place to start is just simplifying the environment. So clear the play surface, clear the table, reduce visual clutter in one corner of your room, or store toys in a container and bins. The more organized something is, the more predictable it can be for that child for safe interactions and exploration. Lighting, just facing the child away from light sources if it's distracting or uncomfortable for the child. So you can consider having blinds or shades available to modify natural lighting. For sound, try to set time aside for play when the environment is quiet. So if there's too much going on, if it's dinner time, there's a lot of pots and pans and cooking happening and people chattering, it might be challenging for that child to engage at that time. They're still learning and experiencing, so that's certainly going to keep taking place. But if you're trying to think of a structured or more controlled play setting, then you would want to think about these factors. And then there's motion. So turn off ceiling fans, face the child towards an area where people aren't always traveling, because high motion and movement can add to that overwhelming visual environment. And we really want to promote across all this active engagement in routines. As I mentioned earlier, the impact of the surrounding environment can vary depending on the child. A child could be really comfortable at home in a more busy environment, but completely lose interest and motivation in a new environment where there's less predictability, less familiarity. It's important to think about concrete activities within their day-to-day experience, because these really precede and form the foundation for later mental development. So what's happening in these day-to-day experiences and routines that support concept development, support visual accessibility, and encourage playful learning where children are, again, actively engaged in meaningful discovery. We want as much hands-on interaction as possible. It's really difficult for most children with CVI, to learn incidentally. And by that, I mean sitting there, looking around passively and incidentally taking in information and learning from it. There's got to be active engagement and some explicit and direct teaching in order to teach certain concepts and tie meaning to visual events. So in order to know how to support a child, we first need to identify their learning process. So what's the learning process for that individual child? We all learn differently, and children with CVI will learn differently, one from another. We're all very individual in that aspect. So does the child depend on auditory information, visual information? How does language and socialization support that interaction? Tactile and physical engagement. What process do they go through in order to gain information and make the next steps in exploration and learning? When we're looking at that process, we always want to think means more than ends. So play really needs to focus on the process more than the product. So not the outcome. What are we doing in that moment? Ongoing engagement in the activity itself is more important than the outcome of that activity. And this is incredibly challenging for us adults, especially if you're coming in from an educator perspective or you want to provide an intervention. We often have an agenda. We have a goal that we want the child to meet and achieve. And while this is important to keep in mind because we want to advance visual skills, we want to enhance development, it's also equally important to step back and just look at the process and see that the child's learning up until that goal is achieved. And we want to, with that in mind, avoid compromising engagement. So when the goal of intervention is the attainment of something specific or a specific skill or product, that process of engagement and discovery may become de-emphasized. So changes the focus of the activity from playful now to task-oriented. So if a child's playing with a toy or playing with an item or engaging in an activity, and the adult starts saying, no, this is letter A, no, touch A, no, point here, no, do this and that, A, blah, 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 that can be really overwhelming for the child. And I think it speaks for all of us in that we would become less engaged if someone's constantly telling us what to do or directing us in activity. It's really important that we step back. So we wait. We also don't constantly entertain or interject. Watch the child. We need to find a balance between providing children with routine security and encouraging them to then expand their own thinking. So we want to let the child lead the activity, let them explore, let them interact, and we want to watch what they do. We want to build off their interests and interject where appropriate. Provide options, set the stage with options, and step back. I just want to briefly share the work of Jan van Dijk. He is a world-renowned expert in the field of deafblind education, someone who I've learned an incredible amount through the years. And he actually developed an assessment procedure that follows the lead of the child as it attempts to discover the process a child uses to learn rather than what he or she knows. So it's watching how they're using their auditory sense, their tactile sense, their vision. What are they using to gain information? What's their process for learning? And then it really builds upon the child's strengths as interventions are developed based upon findings of that assessment. So again, that process and letting the child take the lead and watching them, we learn an incredible amount through them. In thinking about our own assessments as far as CVI evaluations or educational evals, the most success we see is when we step back in those evals and let the child free range explore. What do they go to? How do they interact with things? That's going to give us the most information and tell us about their learning. And it's really important, as I mentioned earlier, we want to continue to consider the child's strengths and interests, because that's what's going to drive their motivation. The desire to play is intrinsic, so it comes from within the child. It's not just stimulated by objects or activities in the environment. The child needs to want to intrinsically engage. So we can begin as adults by paying close attention to what the child likes to do and begin by following the child's lead in play. If they're tapping a toy, then maybe that's when you start tapping the toy. If they're twirling a wand, you twirl the wand. Follow their lead and their action and their interest. And then we can work to expand or adapt behaviors that the child is intrinsically motivated to participate in. So if they like tapping the table, then maybe you can start tapping their body or tap your head and make a game out of it. So you're finding something they enjoy and expanding upon it to increase that play skills. And I want to just emphasize that it's really important that we do not assume interest based on a CVI diagnosis. We know that there are certain attributes or behaviors, visual behaviors that children with CVI exhibit, but let's also step back and think about personal interests and experiences and the way that particular child learns. We don't want to just say the child has CVI, therefore they will like A, B, and C. We want to make sure it's individualized and catered to that child. As I mentioned earlier, it's really important, again, that we find that balance in terms of providing options, taking the lead, and also letting the child take the lead. It's a balancing act, really. So it's been shown that if a caregiver actually instructs a child in how a toy works, the child will be less likely to discover other attributes of the toy. So that self-initiation, that self-engagement can actually lead to greater exploration. Through play, children gain a sense of control over the environment and increased independence. So if we let them self-facilitate, we let them manipulate what's around them, they have a sense of how they can interact with things and find their role and the relation of themselves to others and things. So as we facilitate play, we want to make sure we're just not being intrusive. As I mentioned earlier, add a new item from time to time, but don't force the interaction. Let it be available. See if the child interacts. You might initiate some interaction with it, but for the most part, let them decide. Let them make choices from what's available to them. And it's important to have the freedom to explore. So children really must have a sense that they're free to explore the properties of objects in a variety of ways. That there's not one way, no prescribed way to behave with a particular set of materials. This is so important for early childhood learning. So using a slinky as an example, sure, I could throw this slinky down the stairs as it was intended to do, or maybe I can whip it around the air, put my toes through it, tie it in a knot, bang it against the table, chair, or floor, open and close it, throw it, put it in my mouth, play tug of war with my parents. I'm sure there's so much more you can do. But when you have this freedom to explore, you get to see all the variety of properties that this object can have and the different ways you can engage with it. And this builds the concept. This builds increased interest and learning with that just single material. When you're thinking about what to provide for your child, think about what's already at home. This can really serve a strong foundation for concept development. So you think of the age-old interest of engagement with like pots and pans in the kitchen. So there's so many things you can do with pots and pans and different utensils. You can play with it in different ways. You get different sounds, different textures, different visual attributes. But you're also thinking about how that child is now figuring out positional concepts, depth, weight, size, color, and modulation of force. They know that the cover can go on top and not on the bottom. They know that if something's going to fall out, if they flip the pot upside down, but it's not if it's upright. Depth, how far can I reach into this pot? And how far can I reach into this frying pan? There's different attributes there. Weight, what's heavier, what's lighter. big and small, different colors. And when I said modulation of force, how if I bang this pot this way, what sound do I get? If I bang it really hard, what sound do I get? What happens if I pick up the whole pot and throw the pot? There's so many different concepts that a child is getting just from those natural interactions and engagements with typical household items. And then after a while, you can also switch it up. So a child's been playing with the pots, the pans, the whisk, the cup, the spoon, etc. Let's go back to thinking about that exploration with objects, where the child's constantly thinking about, okay, what does this thing do? What if I did it this way? How can I get that thing? So once the child's exhausted all options with one set of materials, throw something new in there. So in this example, I put balls into a pot. So we've got some of the similar and familiar materials, but now I've added something new. So now we can whisk the balls in the pot. We get a new sound. We get new feedback. We get new colors and visual attributes to explore. And then we can also do different actions with it, as far as picking up the balls and throwing them and seeing what they do after they've left our hand. Lots of incidental learning here. And sometimes household objects are really beneficial because store-bought toys have less diversity sometimes, depending on what you're looking at, what you're giving the child. So again, sticking with the theme of the pots and the pans, these are all Fisher-Price toys that you would go and buy. All these objects feel the same. They're hard or somewhat flexible plastic. They have less variety in sound, less variety in action, and just a general similar presentation. So if you take that spatula and hit it against the plastic top, you're going to get the same sound that you would get if you hit the frying pan. Not a big difference in depth. They're all similar weights. So there's a limit to how many ways you can explore that object. So it's important to think about what attributes is that object or item bringing. And then a lot of these household objects are naturally embedded into meaningful routines. So you're going to see those objects across the day, depending on your interaction with them. Another benefit is actually that they're easily accessible for activity setup. So you can just grab pots and pans, put them on the floor, put them on the table. And really, by doing this, you're increasing exposure to different attributes, different items, which supports generalization of function and flexible thinking. There's many different ways that you can engage with a pot and a pan, for example. Many different ways you can engage with a set of spoons or cups or washcloths or loofahs. There's so many different things that you can do to engage in visual experiences and play and different forms of engagement. And then thinking about how routines are reoccurring. So they happen multiple times across the day in different settings using different materials, and they evolve over time. So the routine is likely it's going to be the same for a while, but it will naturally evolve, which leads to more natural opportunities to shift to new visual experiences, new tactile experiences, new auditory experiences. You can also think about embedding the objects in a fun routine. So I've decided to use Jell-O as an example here. So you've played with these pots and the pans, you figured out their different attributes. Have fun with it. Make it a sensory activity, make it multi-sensory. So for Jell-O, think of all the different colored Jell-Os you can go pick for that child. And then think about having the child participate in making that Jell-O. You get the Jell-O in a box, you can open it up, you can rip open the packet, you can pour it out and feel it in powder form. You can smell it, you can taste it. A lot of experiences just in that step. And then actively pouring the water into the Jell-O, mixing it. Now you're exploring it in liquid state, getting a different, stronger sense of smell from that task. Pouring it into a bigger container and then putting it into the fridge, having the opportunity to talk about how it needs to be cold. The fridge is cold and it's warmer outside of the fridge. Even opening and closing the fridge door, understanding that the Jell-O is now going in the fridge and I'm going to shut the door and it's still in there, thinking about that object permanence over time. Then you take the Jell-O out and now it's in a brand new form for the child to explore, to touch, to taste, to play with. And thinking about the utensils and the pots and pans you use. They were dry before you used it. Now they're wet. How does the feeling of that whisk feel or change based on what you've used it with? Turning on the faucet initially to get that water to add into the Jell-O. So there's a lot of concepts that can be built into just this one activity. And then the child gets to eat the Jell-O and play with it. One fun thing you could do just with this activity alone is put it on a light box. If you get a clear tray and you fill it with Jell-O, and they put it on top of a light box, the child can now get that light and that color amplified. So that could be a fun sensory activity, whether the child's eating it, touching it, playing with it. It's really the process and the experience that matters. So some embedded strategies, letting the child lead again, but find time for turn taking. So I'm going to stir, and then you're going to stir. Oh, you're stirring really fast. I'm going to stir really fast. Capitalize on what they're doing and validate what they're doing. Label actions, visual attributes, and experiences with meaningful language. This is the red Jell-O. I'm mixing, I'm stirring. You're mixing and stirring, swish, swish, swish. Because all of this language is going to be really important for building those concepts and tying meaning to language. We don't want language to be empty. Multisensory interaction with multiple objects and paired language actually help build, again, those concepts and comparative language. You hear about comparative language a lot in the field of CVI because we want to take what the child knows and apply it to new learning. But in order to do that, the child has to have some understanding of the vocabulary you're using, such as long and short. If you're going to teach long and short, you would have had to have previous experiences of lots of long items and lots of short items. If you're comparing something to a pot or a spoon, you've had to have experiences with those objects. All new learning is tied to previous experiences. And so as we move through, pointing out those visual attributes during these tasks can really help with those visual attack skills that I talked about earlier in terms of the telephone example, and supporting that child with understanding more abstract concepts. So we want to start with that hands-on interaction with objects, something that's concrete, tangible, meaningful, fun, and engaging, so that we can build up our abstract understanding of things in the world. When you're thinking about how to further identify activities for your child, think about it in a few different ways. So what are visual preferences? This can be in terms of CVI behaviors or otherwise, but does your child like bright colors or specific colors, single colored things, multicolored things, shiny things, things that move? What are their auditory preferences? Do they like voices and singing? Do they prefer kids' voices or adult voices, musical toys, high-pitched or low-pitched sounds, sharp and unexpected sounds? You also want to think about tactile preferences. What do they like or dislike? Rough, soft, slimy, sticky, hard, and flexible surfaces, smooth, bumpy, cold, warm, hot. Understanding their preferences can help you really focus in on what you should do next. If they really like bright colors, you integrate that. If they really like singing voices, how can you integrate songs into their routine to make it motivating, engaging, and increase learning? You also want to think about that child's actions and method of exploration. So jumping, running, walking, riding, spinning, and rolling. Does the child enjoy touching things with their hands, their fingers, toes, feet, limbs, or head and face? Do they enjoy kicking things or waving their arms or clapping or pulling or pushing, knocking things over, dumping things out? There are so many different actions and methods of exploration. And whenever a child's engaging in these behaviors, we know that that's intrinsically motivating to them. This is how they're going to engage. This is how they're going to learn. So how do we think of all these factors and incorporate it into any activities or interactions that we have with the child? When you're thinking about this, you already know what your child likes. If you're a parent, you know your child better than anyone else is going to know them. But if you want to think about documenting trends, if you really want to step back and observe, that's step number one. You step back and you stay in the moment. And just spend some time observing your child across leisure activities or routines. So if they're in the bath, just stop, think, watch. Watch what they do. Are they splashing a lot with their hands? Are they moving their toes a lot? Are they looking at the moving boat around the water? And jot down the visual, tactile, and auditory behaviors. It doesn't have to be formal. If you want to memorize it, go ahead. If you want to write down a few notes, do that as well. But then you can always look at it later and note the actions and materials attended to, and it can give you a little more insight. I think sometimes we get really caught up in the moment. There's a lot to do in those routines. There's a lot to do in play activities while you're trying to balance 100 other things. So just taking a few seconds, maybe a full minute, just to observe what the child's doing and take a mental note can really help you think a little bit further about some sensory activities, some play-based activities that can happen in the home or outside the home. And then you'll want to put it all together, and it's okay to start small. You don't have to change everything all at once. You don't have to do this grandiose activity. start by thinking about two things. What is one way I can make this more accessible? And what is one way that I can make this more fun? And just know that there's no prescribed rule when picking out toys or activities. When you're going through or looking for motivation, you can go on Pinterest and just think about those things. If you find an activity that is a fun sensory activity, how can you modify it to be visually accessible? So maybe if there's a bin of rice and there's a bunch of toys hidden in it, and that's a good sensory activity, could you use black beans and then put if the child really likes bright colors, put in a bunch of red items to increase visual accessibility. If they really like slimy textures, then you go with the Jello activity, etc. There's so many different ways that you can think about this and apply different experiences. So that's it. I hope that you've gained some valuable information from this to think further about play. And most importantly, again, just have fun. Enjoy being with your child because they're constantly learning from you. Thank you.